Hello, good morning, and welcome to the latest edition of the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. I'm Oscar, and absolutely delighted to be joined by our very special guest for today's podcast episode. We're joined by Claudia Chapman. Claudia is the Head of Stewardship for the Financial Reporting Council. As Head of Stewardship for the FRC, Claudia is responsible for the implementation of the UK Stewardship Code, which is a world-leading voluntary code setting expectations for investors when looking after their clients' and members' capital. Claudia led the review and update of the UK Stewardship Code, which took effect on the 1st of January, 2020. She has just completed a secondment with the Financial Conduct Authority, working on stewardship policy in the ESG division and embedding stewardship within the asset management supervision team. Claudia, first of all, thanks so much for joining me for our latest podcast conversation today. Maybe we could start with, for those perhaps who are listening into our podcast today who aren't necessarily familiar with either yourself or the work of the FRC, if you'd like to maybe tell us a bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing recently at the Financial Reporting Council.
Yeah, super. Thank you, Oscar, and thank you, UK SIF, for inviting me to talk to you today. That's really exciting. So my background, actually my academic background is in geography. I did a marine geography degree at Cardiff University, so obviously a natural progression into stewardship. And then my professional career was in marketing and communications, where I started back at the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. So it's a global membership body for accountants. But I was given the challenge to raise the profile of the organisation's technical publications, the Research and Insights programme, the thought leadership programme that we developed, and soon became much more interested in kind of corporate governance and finance policy than marketing. And then after heading up a policy and campaigns role, looking at raising corporate governance standards in emerging markets that aligned to those of ACCA's growth markets, I had the opportunity to then join the home of the UK Corporate Governance Code, the Financial Reporting Council. And I joined to lead a project on corporate culture and the role of boards, which was sponsored by the late Sir Win Bischoff, who died fairly recently, actually. And he championed this fantastic project which gave us incredible access to FTSE chairs, boards, and other members of the board, CEOs and organisations, to understand what they were doing to curate a healthy corporate culture in their organisations and what challenges they were facing. And those observations in our report led to changes in the UK Corporate Governance Code back in 2018. At the same time, I was also working on some work with the Stewardship Code, helping a colleague who was doing a tiering exercise back then on rating the quality of reporting to an earlier iteration of the code. So when things moved around in the team, I was then very well placed to take on the review of the code that we did in 2019. But for those who are not familiar with the Financial Reporting Council, we are the regulator of accountants, auditors and actuaries in the UK. We also review the quality of reporting to company reports and annual accounts. And we also look after the UK Corporate Governance Code and the UK Stewardship Code, and a set of principles for large private companies called the Waits Principles, which is a corporate governance code for those large private companies. So that's a bit of a run through.
That's great. Thanks so much, Claudia. Obviously, we've mentioned, briefly referred to the UK Stewardship Code already. It's something that generally seen as a kind of world-leading framework. It's certainly driving up standards for good stewardship and engagement, in the UK, but also inspiring other jurisdictions across the world to look at their own stewardship practices, which is absolutely fantastic. It was also, mentioned in the recent update to the UK government's green finance strategy, with a review, it sounds like, coming perhaps in the autumn of this year. I guess I'd be interested to get your views, Claudia, as how do you see the kind of stewardship code evolve going forwards? And at the moment, where do you think you see some of the gaps? And do you see it really meeting your expectations as a regulator?
Yeah, thanks, Oscar. I'm going to take your last question first. So, is it meeting our expectations? We did the significant review back in 2019 and 20, and I did that alongside a couple of colleagues at the time, Jen Sisson, who's now in a head of stewardship role at Goldman Sachs, and Olivia Mooney, who's just started a role with Responsible Finance, which is a community development finance institution organisation. And we were looking at some of the things that had changed in the landscape of investment over the course of the kind of, I guess the previous 5 years, looking at the fact that we were seeing stewardship code reporting very much focused on policy and not focused on the activity and outcome of effective stewardship. Also wanting to encourage a market for effective stewardship where asset owners felt more empowered to challenge asset managers and hold them to account. And we were also required or we were working with other regulators at the time to implement the shareholder rights directive that was coming out of Europe when we were still in Europe. So I do think that it has been incredibly effective in many ways and has exceeded expectations. So we did some research with King's College London, Durham University and Minerva Analytics, looking at the impact the code has had since we launched it. And some of the most significant changes were around governance and significant changes to the governance of stewardship within organizations, bringing it much higher up the agenda. And I think that's been very, very important. An increase in resourcing to support that. So that's been impactful. And one of the things I'm most pleased with was feedback that we had from asset owners saying that because of the code, not only because they report to the code themselves, they felt that they are able to challenge and require information from their asset managers and ask questions. They felt better informed and better able to do that because the code essentially says, you need this information and we want you to provide it to us. So that's been really, really encouraging. So we've seen a lot more disclosure about what people are doing, much more granularity and color in terms of stewardship activity and the impact that is having. And I've been very pleased with that. That's not to say that we're kind of, oh, that's fine, everything's where it should be. I think, if you're continuing to challenge yourself on these policy development areas and you think about, where do you want to go next? So I think that was another part of your question. Is that right, Oscar? Saying
that's right. And just to jump in, I mean, yeah, I think we've got UK SIF, very much in agreement of your remarks, Claudia, in terms of your stewardship is constantly evolving. And I guess our collective understanding of like what stewardship actually means today is frequently changing. And, we're thinking much more around, I guess, stewardship of the kind of financial system in a much kind of broader systemic sense, I suppose. So this is the idea of kind of macro stewardship. So you're not just engaging with portfolio companies, but you're doing that kind of direct policymaker engagement. And obviously, it's very much at UK SIF, we do a lot of public policy work and talk to regulators and policymakers all the time. So yeah, we definitely want to see more of that happening, both through groups like us and other networks, but of course also with investors doing that bilateral engagement as well. And I suppose, yeah, another part of what I wanted to ask you about, Claudia, is I guess you've mentioned where some of the gaps have been, and I guess, what are your expectations for the review of the stewardship code that's due to take place, we understand, later in this year?
Yeah, so I think your point about macro and systemic stewardship is really a really important one. I think it's a really, really challenging one. And I'm speaking to at the PLSA conference this week, speaking to some asset owners who are really thinking quite deeply about, what should their expectations be of asset managers in relation to systemic and macro stewardship, and what does it mean in terms of resourcing? And we've been thinking about, and we will continue to do so, what role can the code play in very much signaling expectations around, what is effective stewardship of systemic and market-wide issues, and what does that mean in terms of what people are doing and reporting and how they are approaching that. And I think there's a few things that are tied up in that. One is really, I think, probably some research or better understanding of what is effective, and us reflecting on what tools are most useful, what methods are most useful, what collaborations are most effective. And I think really reflecting on that and maybe having some robust evidence and to show that. And that would allow people to focus their resources, which is something that we hear time and time again. And I think that's twofold. Yes, there are limited resources in stewardship. Now, some of that needs to be addressed by investors putting more into stewardship, rather than just continually saying, oh, our teams are massively under-resourced. If we think that this is a valuable and effective tool, then it does need to be appropriately resourced. But it's also not trying to be everything to everybody. Sometimes I think to some extent investors need to choose the areas that they think they can be most effective, or the things that are most important to them, and then focus on those. And, if that means somebody else is having to look at, topic X or topic Y, then that's fine. So I think, looking at systemic stewardship is something that we'll have to do with others, working with our other regulatory colleagues like the FCA, DWP, TPR, working with organisations like UKSIF and others in the industry to kind of really bottom that out.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned collaboration, and we see that as absolutely key, particularly to alleviate some of the resourcing constraints that you mentioned. And I guess the kind of broader kind of skills challenges that we've got in the investment industry, financial services at large, and of course in the wider economy as well, and making sure that actually firms are able to hire the talent that is out there to support their firm stewardship activities. And as you say, also dedicating a bit more resource to these really important activities. I might turn to, if it's okay with you, Claudia, to your recent secondment, because you were recently with the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and I'd be really interested to hear your reflections on your recent secondment. I understand you're now back actually with the FRC,
Yes.
but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on your experience while you were at the FCA. And I guess, like, how do you see the relationship between the two regulators, evolve going forwards? And I guess, how do you think we can promote as much as possible that kind of coordinated, joint up approach between FRC and the FCA on some of the things that we've talked about already?
Right, sure. I'll try and make sure I pick up all these things that you've asked me. I think that it was incredibly valuable for the FRC. It was incredible for it was incredibly valuable for me personally. I got a lot out of it, professionally and personally. But it's also valuable for the FCA. So I had some really great feedback from the team that I worked with. And so we're arranging continued exchanges between FCA and FRC colleagues at the right time. So later on in this year, someone from my team hopefully will be joining the FCA again, and we hope somebody from the FCA is going to come over either from the supervision team or from the ESG policy division over to the FRC as well. And I think, I'd very much encourage other organisations to consider this as a model. It is really, really helpful. We've got very good, strong links across between the FCA and FRC at many different touch points. For example, our actuarial teams, or between the corporate governance team and the listing rules. But I was working specifically with the ESG division that works on policy, and then the supervision team. And it kind of, our relationship very much started, when we were looking at the revision of the code back in 2019. And then there's a bit blip of COVID, so it didn't all come off then. But it's really noticeable to see how the FCA's interest in stewardship has grown. And they're interested in it from a policy perspective. They're interested in the authorizations team and the supervision team, and they want to understand how firms are integrating ESG and stewardship into investment, and they want to see evidence of stated policies being implemented through their voting and engagement. So one of the things that we've actually done as a result of my secondment was we've recently updated the terms and conditions for stewardship code signatory applicants, so that they agree to us sharing our assessment, but also their reports before they've necessarily been approved, with the FCA, and also on the pension side with the pensions regulator. So we give our assessment and we can share. And that's really not only at individual firm level, but also just on a thematic level to recognise what we're seeing, so we can really join up and align our objectives across the regulators and policymakers.
Thanks very much, Claudia. And I suppose a good example of the collaborative approach that's been taken from FRC and FCA is in regards to the voting disclosures and the really important work of both regulators on the vote reporting group, so it's called. That's something that kind of we've been involved with quite extensively, and we'd be delighted to participate in that group and really look to reach this objective of having more consistent, more decision useful voting disclosures from asset managers to clients, and I guess recognizing that voting remains a really important a tool that we want to kind of further see enhanced in the coming years. Maybe, Claudia, if you could tell us a little bit about the role of the vote reporting group for those who aren't familiar with that advisory body and their work.
Yeah, sure. So one of the main things that I joined the FCA to do was to set up this this vote reporting group, which the FCA convened, and voting matters, right? Shareholder voting is a powerful tool that investors can use to hold to account the companies that they're invested in. And what we were seeing, or across the board, and I think you'll share this view, is that disclosure around voting is patchy. There are some pockets of excellence. So you do see some investors that are very, they do kind of leading things like pre-disclosure of voting, which is growing definitely, and I know that the asset owner demand for that is growing. But you're also seeing greater disclosure about the reasons that they have cast their vote. Better disclosure in terms of how quickly it after a vote that information is published, and in some cases the rationale for those votes. But that's probably leading in good practice. I would not say it is consistent and mainstream practice. So in response to that, really, and recognizing that not only should asset owners be able to see how their managers have voted, and actually I think it's it's a public good as well, being able to see the voting activity of investment managers. It's important to be able to do that. The director of the ESG division, Sasha Sedan, wrote to the then pensions minister saying, we're going to convene this industry-led group to have a look at voting, and work on a framework not dissimilar to the US's SEC's MPX voting form. And we developed a proposal with industry leaders. We wrote to yourselves and other industry bodies to invite participants in the industry, and the group was led by the chair, Deborah Gilshan, who is founder of the 100% Club, but also has tremendous experience both as an asset owner and asset manager, and is now an independent advisor on stewardship. And the proposals will actually come out on later on in June. And there's kind of three aspects. So a framework looking at consistent, comparable voting with a consistent time frame, and getting information around the categorization of votes according to proposal, but also looking innovatively at the rationales and understanding the reason a vote has been cast. So that is not across all votes, but across material votes, I guess. And then thinking about a public registry, so that information can be analysed and aggregated at a fund level, at a firm level, across the board. And then also thinking about a home for that, a policy oversight, but also an industry home for that. So the proposals will come out. We're very much encouraging people to respond to those in the 8-week consultation period, and then we'll take it forward from there.
That's great, and thanks, Claudia, for the heads up. I'm sure by the time this podcast is out, the proposals will just about to have come out, or indeed will have come out. And it goes without saying, as an industry body, UKSIF will definitely be responding to that consultation, and looking forward to continue supporting policymakers' efforts there.
And it's great, just to say, Oscar, it's great to have you and James involved in that, and James has been incredibly helpful and with his interventions in that group as well.
Brilliant. That's very kind of you to say. Yeah, always looking to kind of play that constructive role, looking to be helpful where we can, and suggest certain ideas that we think can really move this whole agenda forward when it comes to voting. I guess moving on to another policy initiative that's really close to the heart of UKSIF as an organisation is the sustainability disclosure requirements, known as the SDRs. It's something that we've been really feeding into over the last year to 18 months. We've been delighted to be part of the Disclosures and Labels Advisory Group, the so-called DLAG, and we fed into the consultation paper ahead of the deadline, which was the end of January, and continue to feed in our members' perspectives on the SDR, which we think is pursuing a really good positive direction of travel, and is really kind of raising the bar, we think, at UKSIF for defining what is and what isn't a sustainable investment in the UK's market. There is quite a lot of elements of stewardship and engagement that is tied into the SDR regime, which we think is a really good thing. You've got the kind of 3 categories that are laid out for those who are listening who aren't familiar. You've got the kind of sustainable impact, sustainable focus, and sustainable improvers category. But indeed, stewardship and certain stewardship principles apply really across all the different categories to varying degrees. The new SDR regime does propose a stewardship principle, as I mentioned, as part of the underlying criteria for all the different labels, and there's different various forms, I should say, of stewardship KPIs and metrics, and that's particularly important, I think, for the Improvers Fund. I guess, how do you see, Claudia, how do you and colleagues see all these kind of stewardship principles and elements of SDR working in practice? And is there any tie-in potentially to the UK Stewardship Code as well?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, we're working quite closely with the FCA and the team that's leading on that. So as you know, they had a very significant number of responses to that, which is fantastic. That's what we want as policymakers. We want the market to be engaged. So I think it's taking a little bit longer than they initially anticipated to work through, and they're working through those at the moment, and we're kind of working alongside them with that. But yes, you're right. So there is a principle that goes throughout the SDR proposals around a stewardship principle, and then there is, I guess, a more of a focus on stewardship in the sustainable improvers label category. What we are doing with the FCA is, as part of the review for effective stewardship that we're committed to with the government this year, is thinking about how the role of not only what do we need to do to look at, for example, KPIs around effective stewardship, and how do you measure intent and objectives and outcomes, but we are also working very closely with them to work out what we say in the stewardship code, and how that reporting could then, at a firm level, so the labels are obviously at a fund level, but what we see at a firm level is often from the stewardship perspective, the firm will be taking an approach to stewardship irrespective of some of the individual funds that they have. So how can the firm level stewardship reporting complement what is being disclosed under one of the labels? So I think that's one of the things that we need to think about is the KPIs, also the assurance of that stewardship information. So that's another aspect that we're considering, again, in the review of the code under the current principle 5. Review and assurance, there is scope for us to consider how that might apply more specifically to disclosures under SDR.
Thanks, Claudia. And I guess one challenge that we identified when we responded to the consultation earlier this year, I guess, is the potential scenario of a fund that's in that improvers category. I think it used to be called the transitioning category, kind of sitting in there, kind of, and not necessarily actually transitioning towards a sustainable future. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that challenge, and I guess, how do we avoid that kind of prospect of a kind of indefinitely transitioning and indefinitely improving fund without actually delivering those real world impacts that we all wish to see?
I mean, I guess, I think it sits around what we said about KPIs. We'll have to coalesce around something that works, and I don't know specifically the FCA's views on this at the moment and where they're at, so probably need to be a little bit I guess vague on this, but the intention is that, yes, we would be wanting to see progress, and that is exactly the same with the stewardship code reporting. We are asking for signatories at a firm level, using, for example, their metrics and case studies on engagement to demonstrate examples of when they have improved an outcome with an issuer through effective stewardship, whether that be on a one-to-one basis or on a through collaboration and working with others. So yeah, there's definitely scope for there to be alignment, I think.
That's great, and yeah, it won't surprise you, Claudia, but that's something that our members will tell us all the time is having the alignment between all these different initiatives as far as possible is something that's very welcome. And yeah, building that kind of coherent policy environment for stewardship. It's something that we raise in our response to the FCA discussion paper, Finance for Positive Sustainable Change, is could you have some sort of overarching stewardship strategy to bring together different policies in regards to stewardship and engagement from FRC, FCA, DWP, pensions regulator as well, and other different types of policymakers. So yeah, that's something that yeah, we would certainly like to see considered in the coming months.
Yeah, and then that's something we're picking up on. We're committed to doing as part of the review. So we've committed to do this review towards the end of the year, or starting at the end of the year, I guess, more formally. We are already doing light touch engagement and outreach, and we'll ramp that up as we get closer to publishing something. But one of the objectives is very much to streamline expectations, and so we want to work with DWP and TPR and FCA in as far as is possible to avoid duplication, but also align our expectations. And sometimes that is possible. We also need the industry to recognize that we do have different regulatory objectives and do have different audiences. So actually with the FRC's reporting, we've got quite a broad church. So we've got, investment consultants who aren't regulated. We've got investment managers. We've got pension funds, we've got insurers, and we've got proxy advisors. So we've got a really broad range of participants. And so it's difficult sometimes to get it all joined up. And obviously DWP and FCA have, a different set of customers, should we say, as well.
For sure, and certainly there's a role for industry associations like UKSIF and others to actually help guide our members and try to sort of
navigate that.
Try to put these pieces of the puzzle together. So yeah, we have to say we all have that kind of role to play. It's not just a role for you guys as policymakers, but also as an industry and an industry association. We need to make sure that we're doing all we can to kind of support our members in the implementation of all these regulations, which is horrifically complex and increasingly so. So yeah, we spend a lot of our time in the organisation trying to keep on track on all these different rules and regulations that are affecting the market. And we've spoken a lot about, or we referred to really, the UK Stewardship Code review that's taking place later in the year. And we've probably touched on this already a little bit, Claudia, but I guess as we're coming maybe towards the end of our conversation, I don't know, are there sort of 2 or 3 areas where you think that the investment industry really needs to up their game when it comes to stewardship, whether that's improving the governance arrangements for that or in terms of resourcing for these activities? Yeah,
sure. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and then I think maybe say a couple more things about where we're going to go or what we're thinking about with the review, because I think that it's a call for assistance, I suppose, from the industry on that. So where do investors need to up their game? I mean, I think there's kind of 2 areas I'll talk about. I mean, there's probably quite a few, but the 2 areas I'll talk about, we've already talked about systemic and macro stewardship. So I think that we can see often the impact and power that effective stewardship can have on moving the dial. I think we also need to recognize that there's limitations. And I think sometimes we expect too much from stewardship on its own. So thinking about what is most effective, identifying those most effective channels, and then working with others, policymakers, regulators across the industry to address the most significant problems that we're facing on a macro and systemic level. And then I guess the other thing I'd probably touch on is stewardship resourcing. So it's not only thinking about what is an appropriate level of stewardship resourcing, but also I think we need to do that, but we do also need to address that by saying that we've committed, organizations commit to doing these roles or undertaking this work, and then they need to put that resource behind it. I know that the industry is struggling with what is an appropriate level of resourcing, and I mean, many people might already know about this, which is the Thinking Ahead Institute and the Willis Towers Watson are involved in, and the Principles for Responsible Investment are working on a resourcing project to identify what is the appropriate level of resourcing. So I think we're looking at that with real interest, and depending on where that lands, some of those outcomes might feed into our thinking on the review of the Stewardship Code, and to work out what is an appropriate level of resourcing for various stewardship activities, so that there's an appropriate amount of funding for that as well.
And I guess Claudia remarks before on streamlining expectations and certain requirements of stewardship may actually help alleviate some of the resourcing challenges that you mentioned. But of course, also as an industry, we need to still be thinking about how we can be much more open to new talent that's emerging, particularly at that kind of entry level, and making sure we are bringing kind of external voices in who can contribute to firms' stewardship and engagement activities. So yeah, there's certainly more work that we need to do to be more open and welcome to new talent for sure.
I think you'll also see a professionalization of stewardship as an industry. So there's an organisation that's just that's going to launch a course which is called STEPS, stewardship professionals, and I can see already, that there's scope for that, and you see lots of people in the industry, for example, doing the CFA ESG investing certificate. So I think there's almost a coalescence around a baseline level of knowledge and experience. But I agree, I think we can be much more open about where people come from and their backgrounds in order to resource the industry effectively. But I think we're seeing, I think with some of the political backlash in the US, actually seeing people pulling back from filling some of those positions, and I don't think that is a good place to be. And I think the industry just needs to continue to fill those roles.
Yeah, and I guess part of that is, how do we actually kind of make the case for kind of like more broadly why stewardship kind of matters? And I mean, this might be a wholly unrealistic thing for us to do, but I think, the position that we take is pushing for that ambition as much as possible in the work that we do is, I guess, how can we communicate the role of stewardship, I guess, to a much wider audience?
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I don't think using the word stewardship to the layperson is a good. When you Google pictures of stewardship, you usually see that it's about stewardship of the countryside, or it brings some religious connotation. So I don't think we need to use the language of stewardship. I mean, you brought me to kind of 2 points, which is one, the language of stewardship, which is something that we're looking at. So one of the issues within the space, I think, is that the way in which people use terms and people's understanding of terms. So when we talk about engagement, what do we mean? I mean, we think about engagement as a purposeful intervention, perhaps with multiple touch points rather than a single one-off instance. And that might be between an issuer and investor or multiple issuers to achieve a specific outcome. But we don't see people always using that interpretation of engagement in that way. And they might use a much narrower interpretation of engagement, which has a valuable, is a stewardship activity, is valuable, for example, a quarterly updates earnings meeting with a company, but that is, that's not engagement.
Maybe if I can ask you one final question, Claudia, if that's all right. I understand you've just come back from a trip to Australia, where you were sharing some of the UK's work on stewardship with Australian policymakers and investors, which I think brings us to the really important question of international harmonization and interoperability. What is some of the work that kind of you were doing perhaps when you were of the FCA, but now the work that you're looking to do while you returned to the FRC? What's the work that you're doing to kind of really try and promote that alignment in terms of expectations and requirements on stewardship at the global level?
Yeah. So thanks, Oscar. Yeah. So I had a really fantastic invitation from the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia to go over and close their annual conference in Melbourne, and also to meet the signatories of the new stewardship code in New Zealand. It just was launched in September. So there's a role absolutely for all, I think all UK regulators. We do lead in many of these spaces, and that's not, it's nice to say that, but I think we do in responsible investment and corporate governance. The UK has always been a leader in. So we have a really important role, and my role and the role of my directors is to go out and do that international influencing and engaging with other regulators, other market associations to do that. So in Australia, they were specifically interested in, or there's kind of a movement towards considering a whole of market a whole of market stewardship code. At the moment, there is a code for asset owners, which is quite well regarded and subscribed to, and then there's a code for asset managers, which is less followed, I suppose. And I believe, because it's been effective in the UK, that a whole of market solution that brings together all actors in an industry to align to a common set of objectives is the right one that sets a high bar. And so that was kind of the main purpose of my message. But I also had the opportunity to engage with the Treasury and the markets regulators in Australia and New Zealand, and they are very much thinking about, for example, taxonomies and the role of stewardship in in sustainable finance, and also thinking again also about labels and disclosure. So they are looking to the UK to understand, you know, what have we learnt through our development of these things, and, you know, where can they take that forward in a way that's relevant to their own market.
That's great. Thanks so much, Claudia. And maybe, obviously, you will have the last words as our guest on this podcast. But I don't know if you've got, you know, one or two final key messages for those tuning into the UK Civ Leadership podcast. You know, any key messages for the investment community and our wider membership network, perhaps.
Yeah, I guess there's two things I'd like to say. One is, in an area where we often hear that we are time limited, and we are under-resourced, and we have significant challenges to face, I'd really encourage people to think about, you know, working out what is most effective and what matters. And actually that brings me back to the point that I had forgotten earlier, Oscar, which is we need to focus on what is most effective and identify that. And I think there's an opportunity for more academic research to establish what has been most effective. And I know, for example, that some work that was done at London Business School with Standard Life Investments over a period of time has been really useful to understand, you know, actually meetings with investee companies can have an impact on buy-sell decisions, and then therefore returns to investors. So it's really important to let academics have access to this wealth of data so that we can work out what is most effective. And I think the other thing is around prioritization. So it's just really thinking about where you can have that most impact and focusing on those things.
Great stuff. Thanks, Gloria. Some very clear messages, I think, for our members and the wider community. Thanks so much for being really generous with your time and taking all the questions that we've thrown at you.
Thanks, Oscar. I enjoyed it.
It's been a really great conversation. Of course, we'll continue and pick this up with you and colleagues at the FRC in the coming months. And yeah, really looking forward to continue supporting your work and agenda in this area. And to all our listeners, just say thank you for tuning in to this latest episode of our Leadership podcast. Do remember to like, subscribe and rate us wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. We'll be taking a short break for the summer period, I understand, but we will return in September. We've got some really good conversations planned for the rest of our podcast series. Do keep an eye on our social media channels at UK Civ for any updates. And thank you, Claudia, once again for joining me for this conversation.
Thank you, Oscar.